Loud. Ka pai. O tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Claire Charters and I'm from the Aotearoa Centre for Indigenous Peoples in the Law, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this panel on COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples' issues of law and justice with a focus on the US. This particular panel and the other three panels that we're hosting is being led by the Māori Law Review from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, and also to support our Centre for Indigenous Peoples in the Law at the University of Auckland Law School. So as mentioned, our focus today is on the US. But before we begin, I think it's important that we start with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hi aki ane te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. Kia ora koutou. So, ko Ngāti Whakau te iwi, ko Claire Charters tōku ingoa, and as mentioned, I'm a director of the Centre for Indigenous Peoples in the Law at the University of Auckland. But far more importantly are our very esteemed panellists who will be speaking with us today. And we have Professor Aliza Organick, and please don't mind my bad pronunciation, who's from Navajo, Dene, but from the Njinkini Cliff Dwellers clan. She's a professor of law at the University of New Mexico and teaches primarily into the clinical programs and also into tribal court practice, for example, of the many topics that she teaches. Her scholarship is in Indigenous rights, tribal law, and reparations for Native peoples. We also have Dr. Kelsey Leonard with us, who is a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty for the Environment at the University of Waterloo, and she represents her nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean to protect America's oceans ecosystems. She also is with the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and works and researches in water justice and impacts of COVID-19 on Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Miriam Jurgensen, who's a research director at the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and also the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, which is well known to us all actually here in Aotearoa as well. And is also a research professor at the University of Technology, Sydney at the Institute for the Education and Research. She works on Indigenous governance and development and is a highly regarded author on Indigenous and Native American economic development, particularly in Native American and private sector, and also an editor and author in the very well-known Rebuilding Native Nations from Arizona Press. She's a member of researchers looking at economic impact of COVID-19 and with a particular analysis on the federal government's response and the efforts of Native Nations governments to exercise jurisdiction to respond to COVID-19. So as you can see, all an incredible panel, and it's our great pleasure to have you all here, and thank you so much for participating. So our first question is very broad, to get an understanding of your particular perspectives of the impact of COVID-19 on your communities, and also tribal nation and also federal government and presumably also state government responses to COVID-19. So it's a very, very broad question. I would add for particularly our Aotearoa and non-US audiences that the US is a unique jurisdiction, I think, with tribal nation governance and state governance and federal governments all in play. And that is something that is, I mean, not entirely unique to the US, but something that is certainly very different from the situation Aotearoa and New Zealand. So I'll hand over first of all to Professor Aliza Organick, and thank you so much again. Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor Charters, for welcoming us. I'm delighted to be here and to get to know some of the other panelists as well and their work. My perspective over the last 6 months, I guess, being from New Mexico, I'm only about 140 miles from my Aboriginal homeland, which is just to the west of Albuquerque. And in a minute, I'll show a couple maps that might be helpful to your students and to whoever's watching to get a sense of sort of the breadth of the Navajo Reservation. And one of the reasons the complexity of COVID in New Mexico in particular is that the Navajo Reservation occupies only a portion of the state of New Mexico. The largest part is in Arizona, as Miriam will probably touch on, and in Utah. And it's also divided into more than one area in New Mexico. Additionally, in the state of New Mexico, we have a total of 23 tribes, 19 pueblos that dot up and down the Rio Grande Valley, as well as 3 of the Apache nations are in New Mexico on our western border. So New Mexico, like Arizona, is complicated because we have sovereign nations that are inhabit different portions of the state and different areas of the state where there is sometimes close proximity to big cities that are not part of the nation itself. And so it's a really complicated in New Mexico, the way that the data was gathered, and I'll get to that in a minute because that really had an impact on how the way the data was gathered in New Mexico had a significant impact on being able to discern just how bad the COVID infections rate was rising in New Mexico. I also want to give a shout out to our governor. I don't mean to be political about this, but our governor, who used to be the director of health in New Mexico, shut us down really, really early. And so we have had some of the best numbers in the United States over the arc of this whole thing. Now, of course, because of the rise on the Navajo Reservation between March and the end of July, and the striking effect on Navajo people, would not have been as discernible on the New Mexico side had it not been the way that the way that our governor looked at the data, and actually the fact that the data was they counted Navajo, not just Navajos but Indigenous American Indian Navajo Pueblos separately than other groups, and it wasn't just thrown into a group of other. Was helped with some of the response talks. So I just wanted to give a shout out about that. So if it's okay, I'd just like to show these maps, and I won't take me very long because I know that it's sort of not as much fun for everybody, but I thought we would just kind of, and as you mentioned, Professor Charters, the reason that it's so complex in Indian country to deal with the COVID issues is that we have federal, state, tribal, and municipal authorities all touching on the various responses, and I hope some of my colleagues will be able to dig into that a little bit deeper. And so this map shows, you can see the lower 48. Of course, I'm missing our beautiful neighbors in Alaska, but I picked this map because it shows you that the Navajo Nation, which is outlined here in this darker orange, I don't know if you can see it, it really is in the center portion of these 4 states, in the 4 corners of the United States. And so that means that when I showed you federal, tribal, state, and municipal, we are talking about state and municipal matters in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and touching on the border of Colorado. And then again, I wasn't able to get as clear a shot as I wanted to of this map, but you can see here the size of the Navajo Reservation. And right here is the line where the Navajo Nation crosses over into New Mexico. And this area is what we call checkerboarded, meaning that some of the land here is held in trust and some of it is not, and so it's a whole complicated area of federal Indian law. But it's important to sort of understand that within the Navajo Nation, it's broken down into over 100 different chapters. And so that even within the Navajo Nation, distribution, care, and access to resources is divided into chapters, and there's a lot of them, and that has an impact also on the distribution of care that manifested over the last 5-6 months. And then I just thought I'd share with you this map of New Mexico, because you can see here, this is the Navajo Reservation here, but we have another portion of Navajo out here in Rama, which is significantly far enough away from the main reservation point. Also an area here called Tehojale, which is just outside of Albuquerque. And then these little dots here that you see are all Pueblo peoples. And they have their own, of course, jurisdiction and their own response to COVID. So what you see is that it's extremely complicated in New Mexico, and I'm sure Miriam will talk about this in terms of Arizona. It's probably a very similar kind of a situation, although they had a very different response to COVID in their state than we did in ours. So that sort of sets the groundwork for trying to understand the unique challenges that the Navajo Nation had in trying to address the issues of COVID. I wanted to give just a quick timeline, and it's going to feel like I'm firing things off, but this is how it felt to be here when this happened, and it is striking and startling and shocking, actually. So I really want to share this because that's how we were feeling when we were hearing these reports. So on March 17th, the first positive case of COVID was found on the Navajo Reservation. Immediately, the Navajo Nation went ahead and shut down their casinos and tribal parks and closed it off to tourists, which of course affected the economic matters, which I hope Miriam can touch on. A state of emergency was declared within a week of that time. A curfew was established on the Navajo Nation on March 20th. So from March 17th, when the first case was, positive case became known, 3 days later, a curfew was established, which was in an effort to stop the ingress and egress off the reservation onto non-reservation and all those states and cities that sort of abut to the Navajo Nation that are hugely impactful to their economic well-being, because they can't get to grocery stores and what have you oftentimes unless they leave the reservation. By April 20th, there was 1,200 cases. So within a month, there was 1,200 cases, positive cases, reported by the Navajo Nation Office of Epidemiology. And at that time, they designated the Navajo Nation as having the third highest infection rate in the United States, above New York State and above New Jersey, within a month of the first case. By May 14th, there were 3,600 cases and 127 fatalities. And by May 18th, there were 4,000 cases and 142 deaths. And at that point, it tipped us into the highest per capita group of infections in the United States. At the time, by May 19th, which is just a stunning, was really stunning to hear that Doctors Without Borders, for the first time ever, came to a place in the United States to deliver care. They sent a team of 9 healthcare workers, and they stayed till the end of June, providing frontline care to Navajo people. So I have good news though. So and then I'm leaving off June and July because it's just so horrible that you can't imagine. I'll give you those final numbers, but everybody was in a state of panic, in a state of at the beginning. But I want to really impress how hard the Navajo people worked, how hard the state of New Mexico worked to provide care, as well as other resources that came into the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo people themselves really got organized and to deliver as much as needed water, sanitizer, medicines, and and that kind of relief as they could. So I don't want to leave it in the worst case scenario, but I do want to say that even as of yesterday, there were a total of 10,000 cases, just under 10,000 positive COVID-19 cases on the Navajo Reservation. Ultimately, the fatality rate was 537 as of yesterday, and there were 85,000 coronavirus tests given, which is significant when you look at the number of tests to the number of positive. It was so important that we get as much testing done as possible, and so the testing was good in the end. The also good news is last week there were no positive cases of COVID, so we have a lot to be thankful for. The Navajo Nation has issued a statement saying they believe that the number will fluctuate over the coming months, and we may see an increase as we go into our autumn and winter months, which are right around the corner. But for right now, that's incredible news, really, that we are down to those numbers given where the spike was early in the pandemic itself.
Aliza, can I just jump in just to give those figures so that they make some sense to us? What is the population of the Navajo Nation?
Thank you. I was going to say this, but I forgot in my hurry to do it. The population of enrolled members is significant. Navajo in the Navajo Nation is about 330,000, but on the reservation living is about 155,000. So that's the rest of us who live off the reservation who don't get counted as residing there, even if we have our tribal homes are there. We're not counted in that way, but so that should give some context, I think, and I apologize for not doing that earlier. So the Navajo Nation is still under lockdown. It begins on Saturday night and goes until Monday night. They've shifted that a little. It used to start on Friday. I think they're trying to allow people to go into towns for services and for food, because it is considered a food desert on the Navajo Nation, and Navajo people often and historically have gone into towns like Gallup and Farmington to get their supplies. And so it's important to recognize that that was one of the main issues with COVID on the reservation. So so some of those are still in place, and I think I haven't heard that they're going to be completely lifted, maybe partially lifted in the next few weeks, should those numbers stay as low as they appear to be right now. I want to talk about the Navajo Nation response a little bit, and I think maybe some of the other as well talk about this as an economic issue. If not, I can weigh in later. I don't want to take much more time on the top end to talk about the monies that were distributed through CARES, which is the coronavirus resource, I forget the acronym altogether, the CARES Act. In fact, the Navajo Nation were participated in a lawsuit to get access to that money. Well, they have access to that money, many millions of dollars, and that was distributed and is still being distributed through their chapter system. So as I mentioned, there are 5 main districts that oversee Navajo people on the reservation, and within those districts there are 110 chapters. They're meant to be very localized community, like counties, I guess, or parishes maybe would be a way to think about them. And so the monies are being distributed as locally as possible, which would allow them to be as responsive to very, very local needs, given how big the reservation is, how rural it is, how far the distances are. They're not all places are co-equal in terms of access to services, the Indian Health Service, etc. And so it's important to recognize how important that chapter system has been. And anecdotally, I hear that it has worked very well. I don't know if they're ever gonna, I really researched to try to find numbers locally, how the chapter monies were distributed, but I haven't been able to find that. And so if there's a paper in here somewhere, it might be in sort of looking at this from a different lens a little bit further out, and maybe Miriam, you might know something about that. I couldn't find it. And so I just want to say that one of the issues that principally on the Navajo Reservation and why it was so striking, and this has been recognized, I think, nationally, and certainly in New Mexico, it has been the fact that it was a perfect storm of a lack of funding over a period of many, many decades, generations. I mean, the Navajo Reservation is has one of the highest rates of the lack of clean water, electricity, infrastructure, roads, and so the decrease in funding in the Indian Health Service, levels of health issues that have plagued the Navajo people for many, many generations, really had an impact in the way that COVID, the effect of COVID on Navajo people, because, and that, I hope we can talk more about that maybe sort of as we do our rounds later. It cannot go it needs to be underscored that in many tribal communities, the response would have been better had the federal government upheld its trust responsibility over these last many 40, 50 years, because in this amount of time it's just diminished till we are at the situation we are now, where it's the health crisis with the pandemic and with the way that COVID attacks the body had a critical impact on not just Navajo people, but Indigenous people. I think we're seeing worldwide. And it just can't be stressed enough that it was a perfect storm when we look at some of the overall responses. It's not just the immediate response we have to look at. We have to go back and look at what could have happened and should have happened, in the decades prior, and should shape and inform how we think about moving forward to face further, health crisis among Native people. So these systemic inequalities, issues of chronic underfunding across institutions, the issues of lack of infrastructure on reservations, the lack of housing, as I mentioned before, lack of clean water, lack of proper sewage disposal. This goes across reservations in the United States. This is not unique to the Navajo Nation. The highlight was on the Navajo Nation because you see how big it is. It's the biggest reservation in the United States, but it's in a microcosm. Every other community has experienced the same thing. The numbers don't seem as striking because the tribal membership is maybe lower, and so it's really critical to sort of understand that piece of it. Also important, I want to keep talking about the Indian Health Service, because one of the things that I was able to find in my research, which didn't shock me whatsoever, but I think it's important to put the numbers. The Indian Health Service has been, expenditure per patient is a quarter of that amount spent in other federally supported healthcare programs, such as the Veterans Administration, and a sixth of that of what is paid per patient under the Medicare, which is our over 65 population. It has been understaffed by 25%, and honestly, I'm not even sure that number is. It's probably higher than that, because it goes in different Indian Health Service hospitals and clinics may have be fully staffed at one point in time, and that may dip at other points in time, but they're forever understaffed. Housing shortages. Navajo Nation is 8 times more likely to be living in multi-generational and overcrowded homes, because there has been a lack of housing and infrastructure for decades. There is no money to tribes to build tribal housing. It's something of a myth, I think, that we talk about a lot, which is that if they have a casino, they must be have a lot of money coming in, and that simply is not true for the Navajo Nation. There's money coming in. I don't know where. It hasn't been going significantly enough to housing to impact or to make a dent in the shortage of housing that's on the reservation. So that also this overcrowding absolutely increased the spread. And in multi-generational homes, it means that older folks are more susceptible and increase in fatality. So that's sort of the
Wow.
that is the foundation, I guess, because there's a lot more. There's so much more here that I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kelsey Leonard now. But thank you for that overview and for understanding, providing understanding to us from afar of what's happening on the ground. It's incredibly saddening, and those statistics, particularly when we compare them to Aotearoa New Zealand, are really just heartbreaking. And we have similar issues in terms of structural problems here, but because we haven't had such a experience that Navajo have had with that hasn't come through in the same way yet. Dr. Kelsey Leonard, we'd love to hear from you.
Akwe, hello everyone, and to boot me, thank you, Professor Aliza, for sharing all of that information and just really the debilitating impacts that COVID-19 has had for the Navajo Nation, for Indigenous people. Our hearts go out to everyone, and it definitely puts into stark contrast the disparate impacts that COVID is having on Black and Indigenous people of color across the United States and around the world, and in particular too the ways in which our Indigenous nations and communities are having and facing different impacts, but also similar challenges across scales. So just very much thank you for sharing your experience. I wanted to kind of highlight something that you mentioned, particularly about water access and water justice. That's a big area of my current research and scholarship as it pertains to the law and environmental justice and water justice in particular. And I think what you mentioned there and what I've mentioned over the course of the past few months and thinking about how COVID-19 is impacting our Indigenous nations, particularly within the United States, the U.S. Water Alliance and Dig Deep, both institutions and organizations that have worked in Navajo country and across Indian country in the U.S., came out with a report last year, even in advance of COVID. So I think what Professor Aliza was saying earlier about the U.S. has really dropped the ball in so many aspects that have created pre-existing conditions that have exacerbated the impacts of COVID-19 for Indigenous peoples across the U.S. And one of the biggest ways in which the U.S. has dropped the ball is in water infrastructure and in our water systems. And so the U.S. Water Alliance and Dig Deep about a year ago came out with a report that said race in the United States, your racial identification is the biggest predictor of whether or not you have access to water and sanitation. And that's not access for, just meeting your desires when it comes to use of water and using it for agriculture, industry, or business. That's the individual's ability to meet their daily water needs. So bathing, washing, hand washing, which is one of the biggest preventative measures for COVID-19, is something that as Indigenous peoples, particularly Native Americans in the United States, we face a disproportionate impact when it comes to COVID-19. And so our lack of water access is a pre-existing condition. And it's something that all of our communities have been trying to grapple with as we respond in crisis to this pandemic. And it's something that's definitely been a challenge for the Navajo Nation, as Professor Aliza mentioned, but also for Indigenous nations across the U.S., my own nation included. I'm from the Shinnecock Nation. Our territory is located on the southern shores of Long Island, what we call Paumanok, which is currently based in what's currently known as New York State. So our territory juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, so we're an eastern coastal people. But the unique aspect of being situated on an island in the United States is that we have a unique relationship to water, both freshwater and saltwater, and the way in which that impacts our water infrastructure systems as well too. So a lot of our homes on the reservation are using private wells, so groundwater. They're also using septic systems or sort of wastewater cisterns that sit into the land and then have to be emptied. So we don't have a lot of piped infrastructure on our reservation territories, especially in island communities where the geomorphology and the hydrology of our systems doesn't really allow for a lot of pipe systems, especially because some of our territory is below sea level. So it just makes it really difficult when we've had, you know, as Professor Aliza mentioned, probably about maybe 5 decades of the US, whether it's in indigenous communities or communities of color or just across the board, low income communities, not really addressing the major water issues and water system and infrastructure issues that the US has. And that, coupled with a debilitating pandemic that is, you know, unheard of across the globe, really has exacerbated a lot of the concerns and experiences that we've had. So I just kind of wanted to really hit home that I think so many things would have been different, and the amount of loss of life, almost, you know, close to 200,000 US citizens have died because of COVID-19. That's unheard of in the history of humanity. And I, as a water scientist and a legal scholar when it comes to water justice, this is what we're fighting for. If we advocate for water justice, if we codify that into our domestic and international laws, the human right to water is so that we don't have instances of losing 200,000 lives anymore in the history of humanity. And so I'm even more of an advocate for water justice, for the human right to water, and for granting legal personhood to water now more than ever, and seeing the impacts of COVID-19 on our indigenous communities and indigenous peoples. The other thing that COVID-19 showed me in relation to my own home community and being someone who lives off territory for work and for research and all of that is the urban entitlement that exists across our planet. We had this sort of flocking or fleeing to urban centers and to metropolises and to the cosmopolitan vision of sustainable development until a pandemic hits and you realize that that level of density is not conducive to stopping the spread, especially when people aren't willing to stay at home. But what's even more debilitating and heart-wrenching and disheartening about urban elitism and what I have termed sort of the second home escapism and the second home, you know, urban flight that's happened because of COVID-19 is all of these second homes that exist for the urban elite are near our indigenous communities. So for my nation, the Shinnecock Nation, we live and are bordered by the Hamptons, the playground of the rich and famous during the summer, and sometimes throughout the rest of the year. And COVID hit right at the height of us transitioning from spring into summer, and we saw this massive exodus from New York City onto Long Island, onto the towns of the Hamptons, and these urban elites were just sort of fleeing the pandemic and leaving the urban poor to die at outrageous numbers while they came and threatened the livelihoods of our communities and our elders. And we saw this around the world in indigenous communities, even where I am currently located in what's currently known as Canada. We saw the same thing happening from a major metropolis with Toronto. All the urban Torontonians, they went and escaped to their cottages on the lake, which basically are on indigenous territories or on the stolen land of indigenous communities. So our nations had to respond. It's like, what do we do to protect? And so for many of our nations, for Shinnecock included, we closed our borders. We set up checkpoints. We said, it is an inherent right of our sovereignty within the United States under federal Indian law to be able to decide who gets to come in and who gets to, exit and sort of have that egress and entry to our territories. And so many nations, Shinnecock included, we said, if you're not a tribal citizen, if you're not enrolled, if you do not have a family member who is a part of this community, you are denied entry. And that's very hard for a lot of the urban elites who are escaping to their second, homes and vacation homes to sort of play and exist in a fanciful, world that the pandemic wasn't existing, because they wanted to go to the beach and they wanted to go on their boats and on their yachts, and they wanted to do all of these things which often cross our territories, and we were saying, this isn't happening, get out. And I think that that's something, that's been really foundational for how we have conversations about pandemics and about COVID-19, is to think through the way in which we conceptualize borders and the way in which we conceptualize particularly the borders of Indigenous nations and our inherent sovereignty and the right to control those borders. And for me, I think sometimes non-Indigenous folks, when we're closing off our borders, they think of the militant native. They think of the militant Indigenous person that, is maybe warrioring up. And in a way we are, kind of going back to sort of their colonial idea of contact, which is always to fight. But what I thought was really interesting about what I saw with Indigenous nations, my own included, was that the checkpoint language, or the language around setting up borders and controlling our borders, was not in a defense or militance or in a state of anger or trying to fight with non-Indigenous people. It was saying, no, we need to do this in defense of our health, in defense of our elders, in defense of being able to protect our livelihood and our ability to, that Indigenous lives matter in that sense. And so I sort of, really conceptualize our understanding of borders to be very different. It's not necessarily a national security issue, but it's an issue of healing. It's an issue of how do we promote health and well-being. And sometimes that comes through Indigenous sovereignty and rights of self-determination to close borders. And, I know we're going to get to talk about some more things, but I just kind of wanted to throw out there, as we sort of saw the second home escapism, which we thought would maybe go away. It's not. People are staying in their second homes, making them their permanent homes, because they're still afraid of the urban density that promotes the pandemic and maybe is a pre-existing condition for the spread of the disease. And so what we're seeing is people are buying more properties. It is a seller's market. What that also means, for what Professor Aliza said earlier, is we can't afford as Indigenous peoples to buy more land because, we're living in multi-generational homes, because we don't have the capital to buy land or to buy homes right now, because the urban elites and the 2% of the United States and the 2% of the world's wealthiest folks are buying up this land and buying up these homes to sort of have these, I think they're called, what are they calling them? Almost kind of like compounds. That's what it was. They're calling them compounds. So they're buying up multiple houses, especially where I'm from in Long Island, in the Hamptons, for their parents and the sons. And it's and the children, and they're all living in these maybe 5 houses that they bought as a compound for all their families to live in. And these are mansions. One person does not need a 10-bedroom house to themselves when we have other people in the world who are dying from this pandemic. So it's things like that. And then of course we're ocean people. So we still don't know what the ramifications, the long-term ramifications are going to be related to all of the plastics that have been produced because of COVID-19. And the way in which the disposal of those plastics hasn't been properly thought through or cared for. We're seeing a lot of plastic debris, particularly in our waters and oceans along the coast because of COVID-19. So all of the PPE materials, gloves, face masks, they're all showing up on our shores. And it's really disheartening for the impact that that's going to have not only on our environment, but our non-human relations and kin. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to our other panelists, but thank you so much for having me. Thanks so much,
Doctor. We've had a lot of interest from very rich Americans to buy property in Aotearoa, New Zealand too. It's a thing. We've certainly had a lot of people coming home who live in overseas. So we're experiencing it in a slightly different way. I also know of some Māori who are coming home, which is not necessarily a bad thing either. In that sense, but we're short on time, but we want to hear so much from you also, Miriam. We'd love to hear your contribution from an economic and development perspective, but all areas of your work.
Thanks so much, Claire. And I just want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona sits on the lands of the Tohono Nation and also on the lands of the Pascua Yaqui people. And we're increasingly wanting to just acknowledge that and point that out because of the special relationship that we have with those nations that have allowed us to be in their territory. I also want to thank Professor Organick and Professor Leonard for those really inspiring and motivating remarks. I think that one of the things that their remarks have really underscored is sort of the comparability that many Indigenous nations are feeling about the COVID crisis, that there's lots of similar pressures that Indigenous nations across the geography now known as the United States and Canada and Aotearoa feel. But at the same time, there are these really interesting, I think, differences, and you pointed this out early on, Claire, in terms of jurisdictional and governance differences that are probably important to spend a little time thinking about. And I want to start with that observation and circle back to it at the end and really pick up on some of the things that both the other panelists were talking about with respect to water, with respect to urban flight, and then pick up on some of those jurisdictional and governing differences. I just want to start out though with some, what I think are some fairly shocking figures that we really want to take on board. Early on in the pandemic, the Native Nations Institute and Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development were contacted by folks who were lobbying to try to get tribal representation in terms of economic impact included in CARES Act in the Coronavirus Relief Act. And I can't remember the full name of the legislation either. We just keep calling it the CARES Act. But to get proper numbers in there. And people kind of quickly realized we don't have a really good sense overall of what sort of the gross domestic product of Indigenous country in the United States is. So we took it as a kind of an assignment to begin to make some reasonable estimates about what that would be so that we could get an understanding of what CARES Act monies, stimulus monies, relief monies would have to address. So it turns out that our estimates suggest that Native nation economies are contributing around almost $130 billion to the United States economy on an annual basis, 130 billion. So our number is more like 127, but hey, when you're talking billions, these are, you know, let's round a little. And we actually think that's an underestimate, so we're not uncomfortable doing that. That's larger than the gross domestic product of each of 13 United States. So, you know, I think it's like the cutoff is somewhere around like Alabama or Arkansas or something, is that Indian country is contributing more than individual states in many instances to the US economy. That's critical because when you think about what's driving those Native economies, in many cases, it's the kinds of businesses that were particularly affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So first off, they're hospitality businesses. Everybody thinks about gambling enterprises that Native nations run. And so some of them do, many of them do. And obviously those are the kinds of enterprises that would get shut down immediately because of the pandemic. But there are also a number of related hospitality businesses, entertainment businesses, hotels, recreation businesses that are attached to that broader hospitality sector. All of those closed too. So as travel and recreation and discretionary activities of that sort that would bring people together, those of course are the businesses that are closed. So that has a dramatic impact on Native economies. And whether we like it or not, another critical part of many Native economies is actually also the extractive sector. And one of the things that we saw happen that's still kind of going on, although there are some upticks now, is that very early on in the pandemic, we saw the price of Texas crude go down to less than zero for its actual value. So Native economies, if they were not hospitality dependent, many of them were resource extraction dependent, and we saw those crashes occur as well. Now, those are big numbers, and those are critical things to observe in and of themselves. But I think we want to mix it now with this point about the differences around jurisdiction and government. So in the United States, as you mentioned, Claire, and as the remarks of the earlier panelists have underscored as well, tribal governments have authority that's equivalent to the authority of a municipal government the equivalent to the authority of a state government, and then an equivalent to the authority of a national government. So encapsulated into one thing is that massive amount of jurisdiction and authority. And that means that they're the relevant lawmaker and the relevant provider of services for people who live within that physical jurisdiction of the reservation. And for people who are tribal citizens, like Professor Organick, who lives away from the Navajo Nation, but is still a citizen of that nation, the nation's government has responsibilities to her as well. And to Professor Leonard, whose tribal government is located on what is now known as Long Island, and she's in a different nation state, but her tribal government is also responsible to her, and she has certain expectations of her tribal government. So there's that government to citizen relationship in all those instances. So when we're talking about the loss of these economies, what we're actually talking about is the loss of tribal government revenue. Tribal governments don't have the same opportunities to raise taxes. So if a municipal government is hurting because of COVID, because some of the businesses in its area have suffered some downturn, it's got some other kinds of revenue that it can turn to. We know municipal governments and state governments are hurting, but they haven't had the same crash of revenues that tribal governments have had, because tribal governments depend on tribally owned businesses, which often are in the natural resource sector or in the gaming sector, as we talked about, to give them revenue, public sector finance revenue to fund all the things that governments do. So when COVID hits, these businesses close. Tribal governments have this dramatic crashing of the revenues that they have available, and yet they're hit by two things. One is the need for new spending to address COVID, and the other is the fact that all the other things they were already doing, like social services provision, child welfare support, judicial supports, many of those things had extra demands placed on them because of the other pressures around the pandemic. So for instance, housing needs, as Dr. Organick mentions, that we need places for people to be housed because that's a public health measure. So you're getting governments that have more pressure placed on them to do the things that governments do, and yet less money to do it. So that's a really important impact of COVID-19 in Indian country, is these key governments have less capacity to do what they need to do. So in comes this CARES Act, the Coronavirus Relief Act. And in a good way, it has $8 billion in it for tribes. So $8 billion gets distributed to tribal governments. And you think, oh, that sounds really good in the context of approximate loss of $12.5 billion, $8 billion enters. There are problems, though, as you could imagine. And Kelsey and Aliza have also alluded to, or not even alluded, directly discussed the problems with settler colonialism, right? That there's been an underinvestment for years. So first off, that's not money that can ever replace the underinvestment. And it really can't because of some of the kinds of restrictions placed on those funds. So first off, all the funds have to be spent by the end of this calendar year. So what if you need to put in place a water system? Can you build it by the end of this calendar year? Can you even commit the money, which is now, it seems like Congress and the US Treasury is starting to say, well, maybe committing the money is enough, get the contracts in place, get it lined up to be spent. And I think accounting terminology, I think that's encumbered the money. But even that's very difficult to do because of some of the other overlays of colonization, because of some of the things that need to be satisfied because of federal laws like the National Environmental Protection Act, laws around the approval of development that still in many instances the Bureau of Indian Affairs has to do. So there's a slowness of the ability of tribes to actually invest in the things they need to invest in that the money would pay for, but the timing is just off. And so there's a big battle in Congress right now. And one of the reasons we're very worried about is Congress going to stay in session because we need to get more relief money passed. And we just need an extension of the time that's been given on CARES Act funds. So that's one restriction that's troublesome. But it's also troublesome because Congress and the US Department of Treasury have not been very clear about what tribes can spend money on. Some tribes have said, we'd really like to build, for instance, a multi-purpose building, which would allow us to have more space, especially as winter is coming. Not to sound too Games of Thrones-y there, but as we're going to still be combating the virus. And so can we have more indoor space so that we can do things like have our tribal government meet or offer clinics or do education? And when the virus is passed and the pandemic is past, we'd still have infrastructure that would be useful to our community, a community asset left behind. It doesn't seem like that's the kind of thing that is going to be allowed in this spending. It's also been difficult to give direct financial relief to tribal citizens without tribes having to create some fairly complex structures to allow that spending to occur, to make up for lost income. So there are issues around the way that the money has been provided to tribes. And I would characterize that again as a problem of colonization. In a sense, the federal government is basically saying, you guys are wards of the state. You know, you don't get to decide how you spend your money. There's not that basically government to government trust relationship that says, we know you know the best thing to do with these funds and how to spend them. Those are sort of some challenging parts of the CARES Act and some of the big numeric issues that I think we have to face. And I think we're going to be facing them for a while, because it's clear that these same businesses that support tribal governments are going to be fairly slow to return. And so I think tribes are really needing to come to terms with how do we manage a return to normality when our economies are going to take some time to rebound. So I think there are some things that tribal governments are starting to try to do to encourage economic rebound. It's been clear that focusing on single enterprises has been hard, and there was a push for diversification of enterprises or of economies before the pandemic. This has really put a pin in that, saying that's very critical. There was a really big movement, although more kind of grassroots and not necessarily sustained emphasis on a return to tribal agriculture and food sovereignty. Pre-pandemic, we've seen a lot more of that during the pandemic and a lot more focus on how can tribes get involved in the food business. So you can feel in what I'm saying that one of the parts of recovery is a changing shape, changing complexion, changing makeup of tribal economies, and I think that's good. I'm going to circle back to the urban flight and de-densification issue that Kelsey Leonard mentioned, and add to it a couple of things. So of course we know that as the pandemic's gone on, two other big things have been happening in the United States. One is the Black Lives Matter movement, which Latinx and Indigenous people have been very involved in as well. And also the major fires and storms in the Gulf that have really highlighted climate change. I think those kinds of things have increased the difficulty of the pandemic for tribal nations, but have also done something interesting. They've called greater attention to tribal nations. A lot of the times in the United States, because the country is so huge, the economy is so massive, the population is so large, that Indigenous issues get ignored. But the pandemic, particularly the kinds of things that both the panelists mentioned, that tribes have been seen on the forefront of getting good things done. That, you know, on one hand, Kelsey mentions the border closures and the checkpoints as something that non-Indigenous people have questioned. Well, in other cases, non-Indigenous people have looked at that and said, oh my God, tribes can make laws that are powerful, that have an effect, and that those governments are actually really good governments. They're doing good things for their people and good things for the surrounding areas because those laws protect everyone. So that's been some positive engagement that's come from the pandemic. Similarly with Black Lives Matter, the fact that Indigenous issues have been typically acknowledged as critically part of that has drawn, I think, positive attention to Indigenous people to say their issues matter, and these issues around long-term systemic bias are their issues too. So that's been critical. And with climate change, I think there's been a really interesting discussion that's saying that traditional ecological knowledge, particularly around managed burns, for instance, would not have, you know, if those had been followed, we might not have had the same kinds of dramatic effects. So there's been some interesting positive focus as all of these issues are starting to coalesce, you know, this year for Indigenous nations. I would hope that the next really positive focus looks at kind of a collaboration of those things, which is As people flee cities and try to de-densify, I'm worried on one hand that there's going to be another land rush on Indian lands. You know, a return to how can non-Indigenous people, or not even the 1%, white middle-class people get their hands on Indian lands. And so I'm hoping that the bulwark of tribal law and some of the new positive impressions of the effectiveness of and what's owed to Indigenous people will help hold that line. But that also it's an opportunity for Indigenous nations to continue to exercise and expand their sovereignty. And one real opportunity in that, for instance, is Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act regulation through treatment in a similar manner as a state, that tribes have an ability to reach beyond their borders and exercise controls over clean water and clean air for any of those people who want to move up close to their borders. So I think just to quickly summarize, there's been a huge economic hit in Indian country. It's hurt tribal governments, which are key decision makers and have a key effect or critical effect in Indigenous people's lives who live in Native communities and beyond. But a lot of the actions of those tribal governments that they've still been able to undertake despite financial stress have sometimes caused positive attention to come to Indigenous nations and have showed the power and importance of Indigenous law. And that what happens when it's recognized is good things for the people in the nation, the citizens of those nations, and good things for the people beyond the borders of those nations. Thanks.
Wow. I think there are so many lessons in all of your contributions, but just focusing most certainly on yours, Professor. We've had a similar experience in a way that through Māori nations closing borders, there has been an attention to the fact that Māori are exercising sovereignty. We don't have formal recognition by the state of our sovereignty, but we exercise it nonetheless. And for the first time, sort of in my lifetime, at least, I can see some positive reaction to that exercise of Māori sovereignty. And it's really hard to see positives that come out of COVID-19, and I don't want to see this as a positive, but in that sense. But I think it is good that appreciation of sovereignty is happening, because when you don't have that appreciation of sovereignty, people seem to ignore it and don't understand that it's there. So I think that is positive, and I hope that there is something that, and drawing also on Professor Leonard's comments too, that there is something there about exercising that sovereignty for example, water systems, and I was disheartened though to hear that about the exercise of or the oversight, or I guess the restrictions in the CARES Act that place on tribal governance, or this, that is problematic. So we are really out of time. Unfortunately, but I think this has been really, really rich, and I do want to hand over to each of you just really quickly for just sort of a minute of final remarks. I don't think I need to summarize too much, other than to say that it was really important for the international audience, including from us from Aotearoa New Zealand, to understand what's happening on the ground, particularly in Navajo territories and across Indian country and in the US. And those figures are as mentioned by Professor Kelsey Leonard, are heartbreaking. And that idea of this sort of perfect storm of these things coming together and impacting on historical colonization of Indigenous peoples, and that adding COVID on top of a colonial situation just exacerbates these systemic inequalities and highlights the need for reparations too. Thank you so much, Professor Kelsey Leonard, for highlighting particularly water, and then also the urban flight issue. The urban flight's one that we haven't seen yet, but I can see it happening, as I mentioned, because we have international, well, our citizens, New Zealand citizens, coming home, and then interest from very rich people overseas who used to have sort of, as I understand it, a door open to Aotearoa by investing sufficiently here. And the overlay between jurisdictional and economic issues is, that's really problematic. And to see that it might then impact on the ability for tribal governments, presumably also to just exercise jurisdiction as well, right? Just to realise justice as well. So I'm going to hand over. Those are some sort of overall impressions. As I say, it's not really so much a summary, but I want to hand over to each of you for any sort of final reactions. But I'm so sorry. I would love to keep going, but we do need to keep this really quick. So I'll hand over to you first, Aliza, Professor Organick.
Thank you so much, and it's just wonderful to hear from my colleagues across this. I miss people being able to engage at this level because we're always in our rooms, right? Just really quickly, I want us to remember also the cultural impact. Our nightway chants, which are healing ceremonies, take place over the summer months, and then we're just moving into our winter ceremonies, and those are going to be impacted, obviously, because and so I want us to remember the cultural impact as well on our and those are healing ceremonies. All of these are healing ceremonies. They're going to be impacted. And I also want to say that the protection of our Indigenous knowledge lies within our elders, and the elders in our community have been the most hard hit by COVID. And I just want us to remember that this cultural aspect of loss, we don't know, when we're in the thick of it, we don't know its impact, but I don't want us to lose sight of that as we rightly talk about, these other important issues, because we're just reacting and responding. I don't want us to lose sight of those either.
Thank you. Professor Leonard.
Yes, I would just echo what was just said about the deep cultural loss that is connected to COVID-19. I think the deep cultural trauma that's connected to COVID-19 that's going to sit with our communities for a really long time, because it's so horrible and heart-wrenching because it's a familiar trauma. It's loss of elders, it's loss of family members, it's loss to disease, which is something that colonialism has, wreaked havoc on our communities for centuries, if not longer. And so that trauma is not just going to go away. And many of the protective factors that we have within our communities we're not able to tap into or to access, as was just said, in terms of our ceremonies, in terms of our dances and our songs. And, but the positive that I find in all of this, if you can, is that we are so resilient as Indigenous people. We are, I am just in awe and aghast and in awe in so many ways of how our resiliency comes to fruition in these dire times. So taking our dances and some of our ceremonies, if they're able to, into virtual spaces. We have something called the social distance powwow here in the United States, where across Indian country, across Turtle Island, North America, this generally would be our powwow seasons. We'd be going and laughing and eating and singing and dancing all across this territory. With one another and with all nations. And we can't do that because we can't be in person. But they created something virtual, and it has over 300,000 people on a Facebook group that come together weekly to dance and sing and share crafts and all this different stuff in a virtual space. So I think that those are the things that I take away. And I really heard what Miriam said about this land grab potential, right? The way in which history can repeat itself. And one of the good things that came out of our community, in all of this, is we were seeing this sort of land grab of the Hamptons compounds that was happening. And our Women's Warrior Society, again, strong, resilient, Indigenous women came together who had been fighting for decades for graves protection, were able to get legislation pushed through our local municipality because Indigenous graves weren't protected on private land. And we're able to push that through because of social justice concerns, because of just the climate that's in our world right now. And so there's a building moratorium. So it means that, okay, well, maybe for right now, we've got a little bit of a pause and and we can try and breathe and just sort of embrace each other and try and move together for real
solidarity in some sense.
Yeah, solidarity and healing. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, thank you. We have similar issues with our tangi, particularly our burial practices and limitations on that. But then equally tomorrow I'm invited to a waiata practice, which is singing online thing in the afternoon, which and with people in lots of different places around New Zealand that I wouldn't normally be able to participate in unless we're all together physically. So that is kind of cool too. Professor Jorgensen. I think you might still be muted.
Sorry about that. I was going to say there's not very much that I can add to that, which I just stressed with the fact that I couldn't say anything. I really want to just express great thanks to the Indigenous nations that have really been generous about sharing their ideas for how to combat the pandemic, sharing with one another and with states and municipalities, health approaches, legal approaches, and just been good partners. And so there's just been a lot that Indigenous nations have done to once again demonstrate the generosity of spirit that's there. And I just do want to conclude by sending not just gratitude, but also care and concern to all those families who have lost loved ones, friends, family members, because this crisis has, I've stressed the economic side of it, but as Kelsey and Aliza has pointed out, that it's been a personal crisis, and just really send best wishes and warm thoughts and sympathy to those families who have lost folks, because it has been another wound on Indian country, and we look to eventually move beyond it. But thanks.
Exactly, the personal tragedy and the is to be remembered. Just yesterday we had a Māori leader pass. We've only had we're still I think around 25 deaths nationwide in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but it was very sad to lose a leader. I didn't know him, but yeah, I think it's important to remember that. So thanks again to you all. This has been an incredibly enlightening, sobering discussion, and there's much to learn from this. And I thank you for your generosity of spirit yourselves personally, and talking with us, both the Māori Law Review at Victoria University and also with us at the Centre at Auckland University. By way of thanks, we will be planting a tree in each of your names and as part of a native tree planting program here in Aotearoa. So, and we also hope in some stage in the future, hopefully it's not too distant future, just to meet you and discuss this further in person. So just very much a hearty thanks from us here. Namihi aroha for your contributions, and good luck. Ka kite. I'm going to stop the recording. Ka kite.
Bye-bye.